How much can you accomplish in 17 hours? For most people, that's a full day at work, maybe some relaxation and time with family. But for Chris Nikic, as a Down syndrome kid, 17 hours was a countdown to history. He wasn't just competing in any ordinary race. Chris was set to finish an Ironman Triathlon, one of the toughest endurance challenges in the world. Want to know how he did it? Stay tuned to see how Chris conquered each step of this incredible journey, proving that with determination and heart, even the impossible becomes possible. Chris attempted to become the first person with Down syndrome to ever complete an Ironman. The odds were steep. A 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike ride, and a full 26.2-mile marathon awaited him, all to be done within the strict 17-hour time limit. There were no exceptions for Chris, no leniency, no softening of the challenge. Either he'd finish within the time or the race was over. Chris's journey to this moment started long before that race day, years before he stood on the shore, ready to dive into the ocean. His entire life had been a series of challenges, obstacles, and the need to constantly prove the world wrong. Born with Down syndrome, doctors had placed limitations on what he could achieve from the start. But Chris and his family never accepted those limits. So this is Chris Nikic's record-breaking Ironman journey. Chris Nikic was born on October 6, 1999 in Maitland, Florida. Like any newborn, his arrival was met with joy and hope. But alongside that joy came uncertainty. Chris was one of around 6,000 babies born in the U.S. each year with Down syndrome, a genetic condition that often results in developmental delays, cognitive impairments, and physical challenges. From day one, Chris faced obstacles most of us can hardly imagine. One of his first battles came when doctors discovered 2 holes in his heart, a life-threatening condition that required open-heart surgery before Chris was even 6 months old. For most babies, those early months are filled with simple milestones, learning to hold a toy, smiling for the first time. But for Chris, survival was the priority. As he grew, other challenges emerged. People with Down syndrome often face various health complications, from hearing issues to low muscle tone. Chris had to undergo 4 major ear surgeries and countless therapy sessions just to learn basic skills like holding a fork or walking. In those early years, Chris was often sidelined from activities that other kids took for granted. His father, Nick Nikic, remembers those tough moments vividly. Chris was constantly sick, battling ear infections and other illnesses. Everything you do is a challenge. Nick said, "You have to battle everything just to get them to be included." While other kids went to birthday parties or played sports, Chris was often left out. It was a lonely road, but it was one that Chris faced with quiet determination. By 2017, Chris had found solace in a few activities he enjoyed, like basketball and golf, but he hadn't yet discovered his true passion. His father, Nick, always believed that Chris could achieve greatness if they could just find the right challenge. And that's when everything changed. Nick came across a Special Olympics triathlon program and thought, what if Chris could compete? At first, it seemed like a wild idea. Triathlons are physically grueling, and Chris had never even swum the length of a pool or biked for more than a few yards without falling. His balance and reaction time, slowed by his condition, made things harder. But Chris was up for it. With the help of his dad, he started training. At first, the progress was slow. Chris couldn't even swim a lap, and running a mile seemed impossible. But that's when Nick introduced a simple yet powerful concept. Get 1% better every day. Instead of focusing on the massive challenge ahead, Chris and Nick broke it down into tiny, manageable steps. Little by little, Chris improved. He began swimming longer distances, running further, and even biking without falling. His first Special Olympics triathlon wasn't perfect. Out of 10 athletes, Chris finished dead last. But that didn't matter. He crossed the finish line, and that was enough. He didn't quit, and that was a victory in itself. Chris's progress inspired his father to think even bigger. In October 2019, Nick had an idea that would change both their lives forever. What if Chris could compete in an Ironman? It wasn't just about crossing a finish line. It was about proving to the world and to Chris himself that he could do something no one thought was possible. When Nick first suggested the idea to Chris, he had no clue what an Ironman even was. "It's just a longer triathlon," Nick told him, simplifying the grueling challenge. Without hesitation, Chris replied, "Okay, let's do it, Dad." Chris's father wasn't the only one who believed in him. Veteran triathlete Dan Grebe stepped in to coach Chris. Though he had never trained someone with Down syndrome, Grebe was inspired by Chris's spirit and determination. But there were skeptics. When Grebe reached out to his own coach for advice, the response was harsh. "Chris can't handle the ocean swim. It's too dangerous. He's going to fail." But Grebe wasn't ready to accept that. He asked one simple question. If Chris was a 20-year-old without Down syndrome, would you design a training plan for him? The answer was yes, and that was all Grebe needed to hear. Chris deserved the same chance as anyone else, and together they started working toward the Ironman dream. Training for an Ironman isn't just tough, it's brutal. Every day, Chris woke up knowing he'd have to push his limits. His father introduced the mantra, 1% better every day, to keep things simple. They didn't focus on the entire race. They focused on small, incremental improvements. Chris trained 13 out of every 14 days, with sessions lasting between 3 to 7 hours. He swam, biked, and ran day after day, pushing his body further than ever before. But the challenges were real. People with Down syndrome often have poor muscle tone and balance, which made even riding a bike difficult. Still, Chris pushed through. By the time the Ironman in Panama City, Florida, approached in November 2020, Chris had worked up to running 18 miles in a single session. His training wasn't perfect, but he was ready. He had one goal in mind: finish the race within the 17-hour time limit. Nothing else mattered. November 7th, 2020, the day had finally come. Standing at the starting line of the Ironman race, Chris faced one of the toughest challenges of his life. The 17-hour countdown was looming, and the race was about to begin. The first leg of the race was the swim, a grueling 2.4-mile stretch through the open ocean. Chris had been training for months, but the ocean is unpredictable. As he drove into the water, every stroke was a battle against the waves. But he kept going, and after hours of pushing his body to the limit, Chris emerged from the water, 15 minutes ahead of schedule. With the swim behind him, Chris transitioned to the 112-mile bike ride. This was no easy task. Early in the ride, disaster struck. Chris stepped onto a patch of fire ants during a nutrition stop, and they swarmed him, biting him hundreds of times. His ankle swelled up and the pain was unbearable, but quitting wasn't an option. A few miles later, Chris's bike hit a bump, causing him to crash hard onto the pavement. His coach, Dan Grebe, feared the worst. But Chris stood up with a smile on his face, laughing as he said, "I crashed my bike." He was determined to keep going. Despite the setbacks, Chris got back on his bike and powered through the rest of the course. The fire ants and the crash had cost him valuable time, and suddenly the 17-hour finish time was in jeopardy. After completing the bike leg, only one challenge remained: the marathon. A full 26.2 miles stood between Chris and his Ironman finish. The clock was ticking, and Chris's body was on the verge of collapse. By mile 10 of the marathon, his pace had slowed to a crawl. Every step was agony, and the thought of quitting crossed his mind more than once. But Chris's father, Nick, was there to remind him of his dreams. "At the end of this run are your dreams," Nick told him. "You've come this far, and you can't stop now." Despite the pain, Chris kept going. His coach Dan introduced a new strategy: run for 10 cones, walk for 2. This method allowed Chris to regain some energy while still making progress. With every step, Chris pushed through the exhaustion. Mile after mile, he kept moving forward. As he neared the finish line, the crowd erupted in cheers. Chris could see the end in sight. His family and supporters gathered, waiting for him to achieve what many thought was impossible. After hours of biking, Chris dismounted and prepared for the final leg, the marathon. Running a marathon after already swimming 2.4 miles and biking 112 is a Herculean task for anyone. But for Chris, this was the moment of truth. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, fatigue gnawing at his willpower, but Chris had come too far to quit. His father, coach, and supporters were there along the race course cheering him on. At this point, Chris was running on pure determination. He had trained for months, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the physical and mental toll of running 26.2 miles after already pushing his body to its limits. As the sun set, Chris kept going, one foot in front of the other. His pace slowed, but he refused to give up. Every mile was harder than the last, but Chris had his mantra to keep him moving. 1% better. He wasn't thinking about the finish line. He was thinking about the next step, the next breath, the next 1%. Hours later, long after many other athletes had crossed the finish line, Chris was still going. His determination was undeniable, and the crowd that had gathered at the finish line grew larger as word spread that history was about to be made. Finally, after more than 16 hours of grueling effort, Chris Nikic crossed the finish line. He had done it. He had completed the Ironman and made history as the first person with Down syndrome to do so. Chris's accomplishments sent shockwaves across the world. News outlets picked up the story, and Chris became a global symbol of perseverance, determination, and the power of incremental progress. His achievement wasn't just about completing a race. It was about breaking down barriers and shattering preconceived notions about what people with disabilities can achieve. The Ironman organization recognized Chris's incredible feat, and he was awarded a medal not just for completing the race, but for inspiring millions of people around the world. Chris was no longer just an athlete. He was a global ambassador for people with Down syndrome and other disabilities, showing the world that no goal is too big. Chris's story touched hearts everywhere, and he began receiving invitations to speak at schools, events, and corporate functions. He became an advocate for inclusion, spreading his message that with the right mindset and support, anyone can achieve greatness. His mantra, 1% better, became a movement, encouraging people from all walks of life to strive for daily improvement. Chris's Ironman victory was not the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. With his newfound platform, Chris has continued to push boundaries and set new goals. He's now training for more triathlons and endurance races, eager to show the world that his Ironman achievement was just one of many incredible feats he's capable of. Beyond athletics, Chris has also focused on using his platform to advocate for the inclusion of people with disabilities in all areas of life. From sports to education to the workplace, he wants to inspire others to embrace the 1% better mindset, whether they are athletes, students, or professionals. So what's your version of an Ironman? We all face challenges that seem impossible at first, but just like Chris, we can take things one step at a time, improving by 1% every day until we reach our finish line. What's your next big challenge, and how will you make it happen? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if Chris's story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay inspired by more stories of unstoppable human spirit. Let's make the impossible happen together.